David Berkowitz, a troubled postal worker from New York, killed 6 people and wounded 7 others during a 13-month reign of terror from July 1976 to August 1977, shooting young couples and women with a .44 caliber revolver while claiming he was following orders from demons speaking through his neighbor's dog. Before being caught through a parking ticket that led police to his apartment where he calmly surrendered, saying, "Well, you got me." The story of David Berkowitz begins on June 1, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, but not under that name. He was born Richard David Falco, the result of an affair between his birth mother Betty Broder Falco and a married businessman named Joseph Kleinman. His birth mother was a waitress who had been abandoned by her husband Tony Falco years earlier. When Joseph Kleinman wanted nothing to do with the baby, Betty made the difficult decision to give him up for adoption. Just 2 weeks after his birth, the infant was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-class Jewish couple from the Bronx who desperately wanted a child of their own. They renamed him David Richard Berkowitz and raised him as their only son in the Soundview section of the Bronx, a neighborhood filled with mostly Jewish and Italian families. From the very beginning, David showed signs of being different from other children. As early as kindergarten at PS 77 on Ward Avenue and 172nd Street, he missed 46 days of school. His adoptive mother Pearl was strict and often harsh with him. One incident that would stay with David for the rest of his life happened when he came home with sand in his hair after playing with some girls. Pearl slapped him hard across the face, leaving him confused and hurt. The young boy also showed troubling behavior towards other children. When he was just 5 years old, he hit his friend Lori in the head with a toy gun. These early violent tendencies were warning signs of what was to come, but at the time, they were dismissed as normal childhood aggression. David's childhood was marked by strange experiences that may have contributed to his later psychological problems. When he was 5, he went to the Shore Haven Beach Club with his adoptive parents. His mother would bathe him in the communal showers in front of other naked women, an experience that confused and disturbed the young boy. A year later, at age 6, he witnessed something that would shape his view of power and control. When a man entered the women's side of the bathhouse, all the women shrieked in fear and embarrassment. David noticed the power that men could have over women, a lesson that would later manifest in his crimes. Despite these troubling incidents, David was not a stupid child. At age 7, he scored 118 on an IQ test, showing above-average intelligence. However, his emotional development was not keeping pace with his intellectual abilities. He was becoming increasingly isolated from his peers and showing signs of behavioral problems that would only get worse as he grew older. The most devastating blow to David's already fragile psyche came when he was 14 years old. In 1967, his adoptive mother Pearl died of breast cancer. David was completely unprepared for this loss, and it sent him into a downward spiral from which he would never fully recover. Pearl had been the primary disciplinarian in the house, but she had also been the one who showed him the most attention, even if it was often negative. Her death left him feeling abandoned and alone. Nathan Berkowitz, David's adoptive father, was a good man, but was not emotionally equipped to deal with his son's growing problems. He tried his best to provide for David and give him guidance, but he was also dealing with his own grief over losing his wife. The relationship between father and son became distant and strained. David's behavior at school continued to deteriorate. He was often involved in fights with other students and showed little respect for authority figures. His grades began to slip, and teachers reported that he seemed angry and disconnected from his classmates. He spent most of his time alone, reading comic books and fantasizing about violence and revenge. As David entered his teenage years, his antisocial behavior became more pronounced. He began committing petty crimes like shoplifting and vandalism. He was fascinated by fire and would often set small fires in trash cans and abandoned buildings. This fascination with arson would continue throughout his life and would eventually lead to him setting over 1,000 fires in New York City before his arrest. David also became increasingly interested in the occult and satanic themes. He would read books about witchcraft and demons, and he began to believe that evil forces were influencing his thoughts and actions. This interest in the supernatural would later become central to his explanation for why he committed his crimes. In 1971, when David was 18 years old, his father Nathan remarried and moved to Florida, leaving David alone in New York. This abandonment by his father was another crushing blow to David's already damaged psyche. He felt completely alone in the world, with no family to support him and no close friends to turn to. Feeling lost and directionless, David made the decision to join the United States Army. He enlisted in 1971 and was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky, for basic training. The military provided him with structure and discipline that had been missing from his life, and for a while, it seemed like it might be good for him. David proved to be an excellent marksman during his military training. He had a natural ability with firearms that impressed his instructors and fellow soldiers. This skill with weapons would later become central to his crimes, as he used a .44 caliber revolver with deadly accuracy during his killing spree. After completing his basic training, David was assigned to an infantry division and sent to South Korea. The experience of living in a foreign country and being part of the military gave him a sense of belonging that he had never felt before. However, even in the army, David remained somewhat of a loner. He had difficulty forming close relationships with his fellow soldiers and often kept to himself. During his time in the military, David began to experience what he later described as hearing voices in his head. These voices would tell him to do things that he knew were wrong, but he found it increasingly difficult to resist them. At the time, he dismissed these experiences as stress or homesickness, but they were actually early signs of the mental illness that would later drive him to commit murder. David served honorably in the Army for 3 years and was discharged in 1974 at the age of 21. When he returned to New York, he found a city that was very different from the one he had left. The mid-1970s were a difficult time for New York City, with high crime rates, economic problems, and a general sense of urban decay. The city was struggling with budget problems, and many neighborhoods were becoming increasingly dangerous. Despite these challenges, David tried to rebuild his life. He found a job as a security guard and later became a postal worker. He lived in a small apartment in Yonkers, just outside of New York City, and tried to live a normal life. However, the voices in his head were becoming louder and more persistent. They would tell him to hurt people, to set fires, and to commit acts of violence. David began acting on some of these impulses. He started setting fires in abandoned buildings and trash cans throughout New York City. According to his own later confessions, he set over 1,400 fires during this period. The act of setting fires gave him a sense of power and control that he had never felt before. He enjoyed watching the chaos and destruction that resulted from his actions. As 1975 progressed, the voices in David's head became more specific and more demanding. They began telling him that he needed to kill people, particularly young women. David tried to resist these urges at first, but they became increasingly difficult to ignore. He began carrying weapons and stalking potential victims throughout the city. On December 24, 1975, Christmas Eve, David finally gave in to the voices. He approached 2 women on the street and stabbed them with a hunting knife. One of the victims was Michelle Foreman, but the identity of the second woman was never determined. Both women survived the attack, but it marked the beginning of David Berkowitz's career as a serial killer. The man who had been abandoned as a baby, who had grown up feeling rejected and unloved, had now begun his quest for revenge against the world that he felt had wronged him. The summer of 1976 was hot and humid in New York City. The city was still reeling from its near bankruptcy the previous year, and many neighborhoods were struggling with crime and urban decay. It was against this backdrop that David Berkowitz began his reign of terror. On the night of July 29, 1976, 18-year-old Donna Loria was out with her friend, 19-year-old Jody Valeni. Donna was an emergency medical technician who worked for a Manhattan ambulance company, while Jody was a nursing student. They had spent the evening dancing at Peaches, a popular discotheque in New Rochelle, and were now sitting in Jody's double-parked blue Oldsmobile Cutlass in the Pelham Bay area of the Bronx, talking about their night and saying goodbye. It was about 1:10 in the morning when Donna opened the car door to get out and walk to her apartment building. As she was stepping out of the car, both girls noticed a man approaching them quickly from the shadows. The man had short, dark, curly hair and was wearing dark clothing. He appeared to be in his 30s, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and weighed around 200 pounds. "Now, what is this?" Donna said, startled and somewhat annoyed by the stranger's sudden appearance. Those would be the last words she ever spoke. The man reached into a paper bag he was carrying and pulled out a gun. It was a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, a powerful handgun that would become his signature weapon. Without saying a word, he crouched down, braced his elbow on his knee for stability, and aimed the weapon with both hands at the two young women. The first shot rang out like thunder in the quiet residential neighborhood. The bullet struck Donna Lauria in the back as she was getting out of the car, killing her instantly. The impact of the powerful .44 caliber bullet was devastating, and Donna collapsed immediately. The gunman fired 2 more shots. The second bullet hit Jodi Valenti in her right thigh, causing her to cry out in pain and shock. The third shot missed both women entirely, embedding itself in a nearby building. After firing the 3 shots, the gunman calmly turned around and walked away quickly into the night. He didn't run or show any signs of panic. He simply disappeared into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind 2 young women whose lives had been forever changed by his actions. Jodi Valenti, despite being wounded and in shock, managed to call for help. The sound of the gunshots had awakened people in the neighborhood, and soon police and ambulances were racing to the scene. But it was too late for Donna Lauria. She was pronounced dead at the scene, becoming the first official victim of the man who would later call himself the Son of Sam. Jodi survived her wound and was able to give police a description of the attacker. She described him as a white male in his 30s with a fair complexion, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and weighing about 200 pounds. His hair was short, dark, and curly in what she called a mod style. This description would prove to be remarkably accurate when David Berkowitz was eventually caught. Adding credibility to Jodi's account, Donna's father, Mike Lauria, told police that he had seen a man matching that description sitting in a yellow compact car that had been parked near the scene earlier that evening. Other neighbors also reported seeing an unfamiliar yellow compact car cruising the area for hours before the shooting occurred. The police investigation began immediately, but they had very little to go on. There was no apparent motive for the shooting. Donna and Jodi didn't know their attacker, and nothing had been stolen from them. It appeared to be a completely random act of violence, which made it extremely difficult to investigate. The bullets recovered from the scene were sent to the police ballistics laboratory, where experts determined that they'd been fired from a .44 caliber revolver. This was an unusual weapon for street crime in New York City at that time, as most criminals used smaller, more easily concealed handguns. The use of such a powerful weapon suggested that the killer was serious about his intentions and was not just trying to rob his victims. The case received some media attention, but it was initially treated as an isolated incident. New York City had a high crime rate in the 1970s, and random shootings, while tragic, were not entirely uncommon. The police had no reason to believe that this was the beginning of a serial killing spree that would terrorize the entire city. For the families of the victims, however, this was not just another statistic. Donna Lauria's death devastated her family and friends. She had been a bright, caring young woman who had dedicated her life to helping others as an emergency medical technician. Her parents, Mike and Rose Lauria, were left to wonder why someone would want to kill their innocent daughter. Jodi Valenti, meanwhile, was struggling to recover from both her physical wound and the psychological trauma of witnessing her friend's murder. The bullet that struck her thigh had caused significant damage, and she would require extensive physical therapy to fully recover. But the emotional scars would prove to be much more difficult to heal. In the days following the shooting, Jodi worked closely with police to try to identify the killer. She spent hours looking through mugshots and working with police artists to create a composite sketch of the attacker. However, David Berkowitz had no prior criminal record for violent crimes, so his photograph was not in the police files. The investigation into Donna Lauria's murder continued for weeks, but police were unable to develop any solid leads. They interviewed dozens of people in the neighborhood, checked local hospitals for anyone who might have been treated for injuries that could have been sustained during a struggle, and followed up on numerous tips from the public. But the killer seemed to have vanished without a trace. What the police didn't know was that David Berkowitz was already planning his next attack. The shooting of Donna Lauria and Jodi Valenti had given him a taste of the power and control he had been craving. The voices in his head were telling him that he needed to kill again, and he was beginning to listen to them more and more. Berkowitz would later admit that he spent the weeks following the first shooting driving around New York City at night, looking for potential victims. He was particularly drawn to young couples who were parked in cars, as they made easy targets. He began to develop a pattern for his attacks, approaching victims from behind or from the side, firing multiple shots quickly, and then disappearing into the night. The fact that his first attack had been successful and that the police seemed to have no clues about his identity gave Berkowitz confidence. He began to believe that he was smarter than the police, and that he could continue killing without being caught. This feeling of superiority would become a central part of his personality and would eventually lead him to taunt the police with letters and phone calls. As the summer of 1976 continued, David Berkowitz was already becoming addicted to the thrill of killing. The voices in his head were becoming louder and more insistent, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to resist their commands. He had crossed a line that night in July when he killed Donna Lauria, and there was no going back. The city of New York had no idea that a monster was loose on its streets, stalking innocent victims and planning his next attack. The police were treating the Lauria murder as an isolated incident, and life in the city continued as normal. But David Berkowitz was already preparing for his next strike, and it would not be long before he struck again. The autumn of 1976 brought cooler weather to New York City, but it did not bring any relief from the terror that was beginning to unfold. David Berkowitz had tasted blood, and the voices in his head were demanding more. He spent his days working at his job and his nights driving through the city, looking for victims. On the night of October 23, 1976, Berkowitz found what he was looking for in the Flushing neighborhood of Queens. 20-year-old Carl Denaro and 18-year-old Rosemary Keenan had been out together and were now sitting in Carl's car, parked on a quiet residential street. They were just talking and enjoying each other's company when their world was suddenly shattered by violence. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the windows of Carl's car suddenly exploded in a shower of glass. The sound was deafening, and both Carl and Rosemary initially thought that someone was throwing rocks at their car. It took them a moment to realize that they were actually being shot at. Carl had been struck in the head by one of the bullets. The .44 caliber slug had torn through his skull, causing massive damage. Incredibly, he remained conscious and was able to start the car and drive away from the scene. Rosemary, meanwhile, had been cut by flying glass but had not been hit by any of the bullets. Neither Carl nor Rosemary saw the shooter. He had approached their car from behind and fired 5 shots through the rear window before disappearing into the night. The attack had been sudden and silent, giving them no warning and no chance to defend themselves. Carl was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. The bullet had shattered part of his skull and had come very close to killing him. He would require multiple surgeries and would need a metal plate to replace the damaged section of his skull. Despite the severity of his injuries, Carl Denaro was one of the lucky ones he survived. When police arrived at the scene, they found 5.44 caliber bullets that had been fired into the car. The ballistics experts who examined the bullets determined that they had been fired from the same type of weapon that had been used in the Donna Lauria murder 3 months earlier. However, they could not definitively prove that it was the same gun because the bullets from the Denaro shooting were too damaged to make a definitive match. At this point, some investigators began to suspect that the two shootings might be related, but the connection was not yet clear to everyone involved in the investigation. The shootings had occurred in different boroughs of New York City, and the victims had been different types of people. Donna Lauria and Jody Valeni had been 2 young women, while Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan had been a mixed-gender couple. One factor that may have confused the investigation was Carl Denaro's appearance. He had shoulder-length hair that, in the darkness, might have made him appear to be a woman to the shooter. This led some investigators to theorize that the killer was specifically targeting young women and that Carl had been shot by mistake. The police investigation into the Denaro shooting followed the same pattern as the investigation into the Lauria murder. Detectives interviewed dozens of people in the neighborhood, looked for witnesses who might have seen anything suspicious, and followed up on numerous tips from the public. However, once again, they were unable to develop any solid leads. What made these cases particularly difficult to investigate was their random nature. The victims had no connection to each other, and there was no apparent motive for the shootings. The killer was not robbing his victims or sexually assaulting them. He was simply shooting them and disappearing. This type of random violence was extremely difficult for police to predict or prevent. David Berkowitz, meanwhile, was becoming more confident and more brazen. The fact that he had now successfully carried out 2 shooting attacks without being caught made him believe that he was too clever for the police. The voices in his head were praising him for his actions and encouraging him to continue killing. Less than a month after the Denaro shooting, Berkowitz struck again. On November 27, 1976, 16-year-old Donna DeMazy and 18-year-old Joanne Lomino had just returned from seeing a late movie. They were standing on the front porch of Joanne's house in Floral Park, Queens, when a man approached them from the street. The man was dressed in military fatigues, which gave him an official appearance that may have put the two young women at ease initially. He walked up to them and asked for directions, seeming like just another person who was lost in the neighborhood. But then, without warning, the man pulled out a gun and began shooting. He fired several shots at the two teenagers before running away into the night. The attack was over in seconds, but it left both young women seriously wounded. Donna DeMazy had been shot in the neck, but she was lucky. The bullet had missed her major blood vessels and her spinal cord. She would recover from her injuries and would not suffer any permanent damage. Joanne Lomino, however, was not as fortunate. She had been shot in the back, and the bullet had damaged her spinal cord, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. Once again, the bullets recovered from the scene were .44 caliber slugs that had been fired from the same type of weapon used in the previous attacks. The ballistics evidence was now starting to paint a clear picture for the police. They were dealing with a serial killer who was using the same gun in multiple attacks. The media began to take notice of the pattern of shootings. Newspapers started referring to the unknown killer as the .44 caliber killer because of his choice of weapon. The fact that he was targeting young people, particularly young women, created a sense of fear throughout the city. Young women in New York began changing their behavior. Many stopped going out at night, and those who did go out made sure to be extra careful about where they parked and who they talked to. The randomness of the attacks made it impossible to know who might be next, which created a climate of fear and paranoia. For David Berkowitz, this fear was exactly what he wanted. He enjoyed reading about his crimes in the newspapers and watching the coverage on television. The attention and the fear he was creating gave him a sense of power and importance that he had never felt before in his life. The voices in his head were becoming more elaborate in their commands. They were no longer just telling him to kill. They were giving him specific instructions about who to target and how to carry out his attacks. Berkowitz later claimed that these voices belonged to demons who spoke to him through his neighbor's dog, but at the time, he believed that they were real supernatural entities guiding his actions. As 1976 came to an end, the police investigation was intensifying. A special task force was being formed to focus specifically on the .44 caliber killer cases. Detectives from different precincts were sharing information and working together to try to catch the killer before he could strike again. But David Berkowitz was not finished. The 3 attacks he had carried out in 1976 were just the beginning. The voices in his head were telling him that he had much more work to do, and he was eagerly planning his next attack. The winter months would give him time to plan and prepare, and when spring arrived, he would be ready to resume his killing spree with renewed intensity. The city of New York was about to enter one of the darkest periods in its history, as the son of Sam began to emerge from the shadows and announce himself to the world. The winter of 1976 to 1977 was a quiet time for David Berkowitz, but it was not a time of rest. He spent these months planning and preparing for his next attacks, all while the voices in his head grew louder and more demanding. He was becoming increasingly obsessed with his mission to kill, and he was beginning to see himself as an instrument of supernatural forces. During this period, Berkowitz also began setting more fires around New York City. He would later confess to setting over 1,400 fires during his time as a serial killer, and many of these occurred during the winter months when his shooting attacks were less frequent. The fires gave him an outlet for his violent urges and allowed him to continue creating chaos and destruction even when he wasn't killing people. As the weather began to warm up in early 1977, Berkowitz started planning his next shooting attack. He had learned from his previous attacks and was becoming more sophisticated in his methods. He was choosing his locations more carefully and was becoming better at escaping from crime scenes without being seen. On the cold night of January 30th, 1977, 26-year-old Christine Freund and her fiancé, 30-year-old John Deal, were having what should have been a perfect evening together. They had just seen the movie Rocky at the Continental Theater in Forest Hills, Queens, and had then gone to dinner at the Wine Gallery, a popular restaurant on Austin Street. After their meal, the couple walked to John's car, which was parked in front of Station Square, directly across from the Forest Hills subway station. It was about 12:30 in the morning, and the area was quiet and peaceful. John started the car, and they sat there for a moment, letting the engine warm up and talking about their evening together. Christine and John had been engaged for several months and were planning to be married later that year. Christine worked on Wall Street and was known for her intelligence and kindness. John worked as an executive at a knitting mill and was completely devoted to Christine. They were both looking forward to starting their life together as husband and wife. Suddenly, without any warning, 3 shots rang out in the quiet night. The bullets came through the passenger side window, shattering the glass and filling the car with the deafening sound of gunfire. Christine had been struck twice, once in the head above her right ear and once in her right shoulder. John, who was sitting in the driver's seat, was not hit by any of the bullets. He watched in horror as Christine's head fell onto his shoulder and blood began to pour from her wounds. He immediately started the car and raced to the nearest hospital, but it was too late. Christine Freund died several hours later at St. John's Hospital in Elmhurst, becoming the second person to be murdered by the .44 caliber killer. The ballistics examination of the bullets recovered from the scene confirmed what police already suspected. They had been fired from the same .44 caliber revolver that had been used in the previous attacks. The killer was definitely the same person, and he was becoming more deadly with each attack. This shooting was particularly significant because it occurred in Forest Hills, which was considered to be one of the safer neighborhoods in Queens. The area was well lit and heavily patrolled by police, yet the killer had still managed to carry out his attack and escape without being seen. This demonstrated that nowhere in the city was truly safe from the .44 caliber killer. The media coverage of Christine Freund's murder was extensive, and the public's fear began to reach new levels. The fact that the killer had now struck 4 times and had killed 2 people made it clear that he was not going to stop on his own. The police were under enormous pressure to catch him before he could kill again. Less than 6 weeks later, on March 8, 1977, the killer struck again, and this time his attack was even more brazen. 19-year-old Virginia Voskerikian was a bright, intelligent student at Columbia University who was studying Russian literature. She had been born in Bulgaria and had immigrated to the United States with her family when she was young. She was known for her serious dedication to her studies and her plans to become a teacher. On that March evening, Virginia had stayed late at the Columbia University Library, working on her studies as she often did. She took the subway from Manhattan back to her family's home in Forest Hills, getting off at the Continental Avenue station. It was about 7:30 in the evening, and the area was still busy with commuters making their way home from work. Virginia walked the few blocks from the subway station toward her home on Exeter Street, carrying her heavy college textbooks in her arms. The route took her along well-lit streets that she had walked hundreds of times before. She had no reason to be afraid or to suspect that danger was lurking in the shadows. As Virginia walked under an archway and turned onto Exeter Street, she found herself alone on the sidewalk. It was one of those moments during rush hour when the street suddenly empties of people, leaving a person isolated and vulnerable. She was just a few hundred yards from her house when a man suddenly jumped out in front of her. The man was holding a gun and pointing it directly at her. Virginia, who was a small, delicate young woman, reacted instinctively by holding her thick textbook up in front of her face, hoping to protect herself from whatever was about to happen. But the textbook provided no protection against a .44 caliber bullet. The killer pressed the gun against the book and fired. The bullet tore through the book and into Virginia's head, killing her instantly. She collapsed to the ground, her blood soaking into the pine needles and grass that lined the walkway. The killer then fired several more shots before running away into the night. This attack was particularly cold-blooded because it had occurred early in the evening in a residential area where the killer could easily have been seen by witnesses. The fact that he was willing to take such risks suggested that he was becoming more confident and more reckless. The ballistics examination once again confirmed that the same .44 caliber revolver had been used. More significantly, this shooting had occurred less than half a block from where Christine Freund had been killed just 6 weeks earlier. The killer was clearly familiar with the Forest Hills area and felt comfortable operating there. The murder of Virginia Voskerikian sent shockwaves through the Columbia University community and throughout New York City. Here was a brilliant young woman who had been killed for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her family was devastated, and her professors and classmates struggled to understand how such a senseless tragedy could occur. The police investigation was now in full swing. The NYPD had formed Operation Omega, a special task force dedicated specifically to catching the .44 caliber killer. The task force was led by Inspector Timothy Dowd and included some of the best detectives in the city. They were working around the clock, following up on hundreds of tips and investigating every possible lead. However, the killer remained one step ahead of them. David Berkowitz was careful about his movements and was becoming increasingly sophisticated in his methods. He would drive around the city for hours, looking for potential victims and escape routes. He was also becoming more aware of police procedures and was taking steps to avoid being caught. The media coverage of the killings was becoming more intense with each attack. Newspapers were devoting front-page coverage to the story, and television news programs were leading with updates on the investigation. The public was demanding action, and politicians were putting enormous pressure on the police to solve the case. Young women throughout New York City were living in fear. Many were changing their daily routines, avoiding going out at night, and being extra careful about where they parked their cars. The randomness of the attacks made it impossible to know who might be next, and this uncertainty was creating a climate of terror. David Berkowitz was enjoying all of this attention. He would buy newspapers and read every article about his crimes, and he would watch the television coverage with great satisfaction. The fear and chaos he was creating gave him a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before. But the voices in his head were not satisfied with what he had accomplished so far. They were demanding more killing, more blood, and more terror. And they were about to push him to take his reign of terror to an entirely new level. As the spring of 1977 progressed, David Berkowitz was becoming increasingly emboldened by his success in evading capture. He had now killed 3 people and wounded several others, yet the police seemed no closer to catching him than they had been after his first attack. The voices in his head were praising him for his work and encouraging him to continue his mission. But the voices were also telling him that it was time to make his presence known to the world in a more direct way. They wanted him to communicate with the police and the media, to let them know who was responsible for the terror that was gripping New York City. This marked a significant evolution in Berkowitz's behavior, as he began to crave not just the act of killing, but also the recognition and notoriety that came with it. On the night of April 17, 1977, Berkowitz prepared for what would become one of his most significant attacks. He chose as his location the Hutchinson River Parkway in the Bronx, an area where young couples often went to park and spend time together. He had scouted the location in advance and knew exactly how he would approach his victims and how he would escape. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, 18-year-old Valentina Siriani and 20-year-old Alexander Esau were sitting in Valentina's car, parked on a quiet stretch of the parkway not far from Valentina's home. Valentina was a recent graduate of St. Catherine's Academy in the Bronx, the same school that would later be attended by another of Berkowitz's victims. Alexander was a tow truck operator who was completely devoted to Valentina. The young couple had been out together for the evening and had stopped to talk privately before heading home. They had no idea that they were being watched from the shadows by a man with a gun who was preparing to end their lives. Berkowitz approached the car from behind, moving quietly and carefully to avoid being detected. When he was close enough, he raised his .44 caliber revolver and began firing. He shot both Valentina and Alexander twice each, the powerful bullets tearing through the car and into their bodies. Alexander Esau died at the scene, while Valentina Siriani died later at the hospital despite the best efforts of the emergency medical personnel who tried to save her. The double murder brought Berkowitz's death toll to 4 people, with several others wounded. But this attack was different from the previous ones in a crucial way. For the first time, the killer left behind a note at the crime scene. The note was handwritten and addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli, the commanding officer of the NYPD's Detective Division. It was in this note that the killer first identified himself as Son of Sam. The note was rambling and largely incoherent, but it contained several key elements that would become central to the Son of Sam legend. The killer wrote about his mission to kill and about the forces that were compelling him to carry out his attacks. He also taunted the police for their inability to catch him and promised that the killings would continue. "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women hater," the note read in part. "I am not, but I am a monster. I am the Son of Sam. I am a little brat. I live for the hunt. My life. Police, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back. David Berkowitz. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. Bang. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster. The note was filled with spelling errors and grammatical mistakes, but it was clear that the writer was intelligent and was deliberately crafting a persona for himself. The signature, Son of Sam, would become one of the most famous criminal nicknames in American history. When the police discovered the note, they immediately recognized its significance. This was the first direct communication they had received from the killer, and it provided them with important clues about his mental state and his motivations. The handwriting was analyzed by experts, and copies of the note were distributed to police departments throughout the city. However, the police made the decision not to release the full contents of the note to the public immediately. They were concerned that doing so might encourage copycat crimes, or might give the killer the attention he was seeking. Instead, they released only limited information about the note while continuing to investigate its contents. The media, however, quickly learned about the existence of the note and began reporting that the .44 caliber killer had identified himself as the Son of Sam. This name captured the public's imagination in a way that the previous designation had not. There was something both childish and menacing about the name that seemed to perfectly capture the random and senseless nature of the crimes. The murder of Valentinus Suriani and Alexander Esau also marked another troubling escalation in the killer's behavior. This was the first time he had killed 2 people in a single attack, and it demonstrated that he was becoming more aggressive and more confident. The fact that he had left a note behind also showed that he was no longer content to simply kill people. He wanted to be famous for his crimes. David Berkowitz was indeed enjoying the attention that the Son of Sam name was generating. He would buy multiple copies of newspapers that mentioned the case, and would watch every television news report about the investigation. The fear and fascination that he was generating throughout the city gave him a sense of importance and power that he had never experienced before. But the voices in his head were not satisfied with just one letter. They were telling him that he needed to communicate more directly with the media and the public. They wanted him to explain his mission and to let people know why he was killing them. This would lead to one of the most famous pieces of correspondence in criminal history. About a month after the Suriani-Esau murders, on May 30th, 1977, Jimmy Breslin, a prominent columnist for the New York Daily News, received a letter in the mail. The letter was handwritten in the same distinctive script as the note that had been left at the crime scene, and it was signed Son of Sam. The letter to Breslin was longer and more detailed than the first note, and it revealed more about the killer's mental state and his motivations. Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood. The letter began. Hello from the sewers of NYC, which swallow up these delicacies when they are washed away by the sweeper trucks. The letter went on to reference some of the previous victims by name, showing that the killer was closely following the media coverage of his crimes. Don't think, because you haven't heard from me for a while, that I went to sleep, he wrote. No, rather, I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest, anxious to please Sam. Most ominously, the letter promised more violence to come. Tell me, Jim, what will you have for July 29th? The letter asked, referencing the 1-year anniversary of the first attack. This suggested that the killer was planning something special for that date, which sent chills through everyone who read it. The Daily News faced a difficult decision about whether to publish the letter. On one hand, it was clearly newsworthy, and the public had a right to know what the killer was saying. On the other hand, publishing the letter would give the killer exactly the kind of attention he was seeking and might encourage him to commit more crimes. After consulting with the police, the Daily News decided to publish portions of the letter while withholding some of the more inflammatory passages. The publication of the letter caused a sensation throughout New York City and beyond. The Daily News sold over 1 million copies that day, making it one of the biggest selling issues in the newspaper's history. The letter to Jimmy Breslin marked a turning point in the Son of Sam case. The killer was no longer just a faceless murderer stalking the streets of New York. He was now a personality with his own voice and his own twisted philosophy. This made him even more frightening to the public, but it also gave the police more clues to work with in their investigation. The handwriting analysis of the letter provided investigators with important information about the killer's background and education level. Psychiatrists and criminal profilers began developing psychological profiles of the killer based on the content and tone of his communications. However, David Berkowitz was not finished communicating with the world. The positive response he had received to his letter to Breslin encouraged him to continue writing, and he began planning more correspondence that would further terrify the city and taunt the police who were trying to catch him. The summer of 1977 was shaping up to be one of the hottest and most tense in New York City's history. The son of Sam was now a household name, and his promise in the letter to Jimmy Breslin that something special would happen on July 29th, the one-year anniversary of his first attack, had the entire city on edge. The police investigation had intensified to unprecedented levels. Operation Omega, the special task force dedicated to catching the son of Sam, had grown to include over 200 detectives and officers. They were working around the clock, following up on thousands of tips and investigating every possible lead. The pressure on the police department was enormous, as politicians and the public demanded results. Young women throughout New York City had changed their behavior dramatically. Many had cut their long dark hair short or had dyed it blonde, hoping to avoid fitting the profile of the killer's preferred victims. Others had stopped going out at night altogether, afraid that they might become the next target. The randomness of the attacks made it impossible to predict where the killer might strike next, creating a climate of fear that affected everyone in the city. The media coverage was relentless. Newspapers devoted front-page coverage to every development in the case, and television news programs led with son of Sam stories night after night. The killer had become a celebrity, which was exactly what he wanted. David Berkowitz was reading every article and watching every news report, basking in the attention and notoriety. As June turned into July, the tension in the city continued to build. The police had increased their patrols in areas where the previous attacks had occurred, and they were paying special attention to locations where young couples might park their cars. However, the vastness of New York City made it virtually impossible to protect every potential target. On the night of June 26, 1977, the son of Sam struck again, demonstrating that the increased police presence had not deterred him from continuing his killing spree. 17-year-old Judy Placido and 20-year-old Salvatore Lupo were sitting in Sal's car outside the Eliphaz discotheque in Bayside, Queens, when their world was suddenly shattered by gunfire. Judy had just graduated from St. Catherine's Academy in the Bronx, the same school that Valentina Suriani had attended. She was celebrating her graduation and looking forward to starting the next chapter of her life, when she became the son of Sam's latest victim. At about 3:20 in the morning, as Judy and Sal were talking in the parked car, shots rang out. The killer had approached the car from behind and had fired through the windows, just as he had done in his previous attacks. The sound of shattering glass and the explosions of the gunshots filled the car, creating chaos and terror. Judy was hit 3 times, in the head, neck, and shoulder. One of the bullets had passed through Sal's forearm before hitting her in the neck, coming to rest just 1/4 of an inch from her spinal cord. If it had moved just slightly, it could have paralyzed or killed her. Sal was hit in the forearm, but was not seriously injured. Both victims survived the attack, but they were severely traumatized by the experience. Judy, in particular, would struggle with the psychological effects of the shooting for decades to come. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars would remain with her for the rest of her life. The ballistics examination confirmed that the same .44 caliber revolver had been used in this attack. The son of Sam had now shot at least 12 people, killing 4 and wounding 8 others. The fact that he was continuing to use the same weapon suggested either that he was very confident he wouldn't be caught, or that he had some emotional attachment to the gun. The attack on Judy Placido and Sal Lupo demonstrated that the killer was not intimidated by the massive police presence that was now searching for him. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the cat-and-mouse game he was playing with law enforcement. The voices in his head were telling him that he was too clever to be caught, and that he could continue killing indefinitely. The July 29th anniversary date that the son of Sam had referenced in his letter to Jimmy Breslin came and went without incident, much to the relief of police and the public. However, this respite was short-lived, as the killer was already planning what would turn out to be his final and most significant attack. On the night of July 31st, 1977, just 2 days after the anniversary date, 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz and 20-year-old Robert Violante were on their first date together. They had met just a few nights earlier at a gong show event at Beefsteak Charlie's restaurant, and there had been an immediate attraction between them. Robert was a handsome young man who had just been signed by the prestigious Wilhelmina modeling agency. He looked like John Travolta, who was at the height of his fame due to the movie Saturday Night Fever, and he seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. Stacy was a beautiful college student with blonde hair who was known for her bubbly personality and zest for life. For their first date, Robert and Stacy went to see the movie New York, New York, and then drove to Shore Parkway in Brooklyn, near the water. This was significant because it was the first time the son of Sam had struck in Brooklyn, and it was also the first time he had attacked a victim with blonde hair. The couple walked along the waterfront and played on a set of swings in a nearby park, acting like children and enjoying each other's company. They were completely unaware that they were being watched from the shadows by a man with a gun who was preparing to end their happiness forever. As they sat in Robert's car, parked in a lover's lane area overlooking the Brooklyn waterfront, Stacy noticed a figure lurking in the shadows with his arms crossed. She became uncomfortable and asked Robert if they could leave, but he convinced her to stay for just a few more minutes. It was a decision that would haunt Robert for the rest of his life. At 2:35 in the morning, the car windows suddenly exploded as 4 shots rang out. Both Robert and Stacy were hit in the head by .44 caliber bullets. The powerful slugs caused devastating damage, and both victims immediately lost consciousness. Robert was shot once, and the bullet destroyed his left eye and damaged his right eye as it tore across his skull. By all rights, he should have died from such a massive head wound, but somehow he survived. Stacy was hit twice in the head, and despite the best efforts of the medical team that treated her, she died 18 hours later at the hospital. Despite being blinded and gravely wounded, Robert managed to open the car door and wrap his hand around a nearby light pole. He began honking the car horn repeatedly and screaming for help until the battery died and he collapsed in the street. His actions undoubtedly saved his life, as the quick response by emergency medical personnel was crucial to his survival. The murder of Stacy Moskowitz and the wounding of Robert Violante would prove to be the son of Sam's final attack. Unknown to him at the time, this crime would also provide the clue that would lead to his capture just 10 days later. As news of the Brooklyn shooting spread, the fear in New York City reached its absolute peak. The killer had now struck in 3 different boroughs, had killed 6 people and wounded 7 others, and had shown that nowhere in the city was safe from his attacks. The fact that he had attacked a blonde victim for the first time suggested that he was expanding his target selection, which meant that even more women were now at risk. David Berkowitz was pleased with the media coverage of his latest attack. The newspapers were filled with stories about the shooting, and the television news programs were leading with updates on the condition of the victims. He had successfully terrorized the largest city in America, and he was basking in the attention and notoriety. But the voices in his head were beginning to change their tune. Instead of encouraging him to continue killing, they were now warning him that his time was running out. They were telling him that the police were getting closer and that he needed to be more careful. These warnings would prove to be prophetic, as the investigation was indeed about to take a dramatic turn. The investigation into the Stacy Moskowitz murder began immediately, but this time the police had something they had never had before in a son of Sam case: witnesses. Several people in the Brooklyn neighborhood had seen suspicious activity on the night of the shooting, and their observations would prove to be crucial in finally identifying the killer. One of the most important witnesses was a woman named Cecilia Davis, who lived in an apartment building near the crime scene. On the night of July 31st, she had been looking out her window when she saw a man standing near the park where Stacy and Robert had been walking earlier. The man seemed to be watching them, and his behavior struck her as suspicious. Later that same evening, Davis heard the sound of gunshots coming from the direction of the waterfront. When she looked out her window again, she saw a man walking quickly away from the scene. The man appeared to be in his 20s or early 30s, had dark hair, and was wearing jeans and a light-colored shirt. Even more significantly, Davis saw the man get into a car that was parked nearby. She was able to provide police with a general description of the vehicle, which was described as a light-colored sedan. This was the first time that any witness had been able to provide information about the killer's getaway car. Another important witness was Tommy Zano, who had been parked in his car near the crime scene with his girlfriend. Zeno reported seeing a man with what appeared to be straggly, light brown hair walking near the area where the shooting occurred. This description was somewhat different from previous witness accounts, but it would later prove to be significant. The most crucial break in the case came from an unexpected source. Cecilia Davis remembered that earlier in the evening, before the shooting occurred, she had seen police officers writing parking tickets on her street. This detail might have seemed insignificant, but it would prove to be the key to solving the entire case. Detective James Justice of the NYPD was assigned to follow up on this lead. He contacted the Parking Violations Bureau and requested a list of all parking tickets that had been issued in the area around the time of the shooting. The list contained several dozen tickets, but one in particular caught his attention. A cream-colored Ford Galaxy had been ticketed for parking too close to a fire hydrant on Base 17th Street, just a few blocks from where the shooting had occurred. The ticket had been issued at 2:05 a.m., just 30 minutes before the attack took place. The car was registered to a David R. Berkowitz of 35 Pine Street, Yonkers, New York. Detective Justice ran a background check on Berkowitz and discovered that he was a 24-year-old postal worker with no serious criminal record. However, when Justice contacted the Yonkers Police Department to ask if they had any information about Berkowitz, he learned something very interesting. The Yonkers police told Justice that they had received several complaints about Berkowitz from his neighbors, particularly from a man named Sam Carr. Carr had reported that Berkowitz had been sending him threatening letters and had even shot his dog with a small-caliber weapon. The dog's name was Harvey, and Carr lived on Wicker Street, not far from Berkowitz's apartment. The connection to a neighbor named Sam was immediately significant to the investigators, as the son of Sam had referenced Sam in his letters to the police and the media. This could not be a coincidence, and it suggested that David Berkowitz might indeed be the killer they had been searching for. On August 9, 1977, Detective Justice and several other investigators drove to Yonkers to conduct surveillance on Berkowitz's apartment building. They were hoping to get a look at him and to see if he matched the descriptions provided by witnesses to the various shootings. When they arrived at 35 Pine Street, they immediately spotted the cream-colored Ford Galaxy parked outside the building. As they moved closer to examine the car, they made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. Sitting in the back seat of the car was a rifle in a duffel bag. Even more significantly, there was an envelope on the seat that was addressed to Inspector Timothy Dowd, the head of the Operation Omega Task Force. The envelope contained a letter written in the same handwriting that had been used in the previous son of Sam communications. The investigators realized that they had found their man. David Richard Berkowitz was the son of Sam, the killer who had terrorized New York City for over a year. However, they decided to wait before making the arrest, as they wanted to obtain a search warrant for his apartment, and they wanted to make sure they handled the arrest properly. The surveillance of Berkowitz continued throughout the day on August 10th. The investigators watched as he went about his normal routine, completely unaware that his reign of terror was about to come to an end. He appeared to be an ordinary, somewhat overweight young man who looked nothing like the menacing figure that the public had imagined. That evening, as darkness began to fall, Berkowitz left his apartment building and walked toward his car. The investigators knew that this was their moment. Detective John Folotico approached the driver's side of the car, while Detective Sergeant William Gardella moved to the passenger side. As Berkowitz got into his car and started to put the key in the ignition, Detective Folotico appeared at his window with his gun drawn. "Police, don't move," Folotico commanded. Berkowitz looked up at the detective with a strange expression on his face. Instead of showing surprise or fear, he smiled slightly and said calmly, "Well, you got me. What took you so long?" Next to him on the seat was a paper bag containing the .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver that had been used in all of the son of Sam attacks. The gun that had killed 6 people and wounded 7 others was finally in the hands of the police. As Berkowitz was being handcuffed and placed under arrest, he continued to smile and appeared almost relieved that his killing spree was finally over. The voices in his head, which had been warning him that his time was running out, had been correct. The net had finally closed around the son of Sam. The arrest of David Berkowitz on the evening of August 10, 1977, marked the end of one of the most intensive manhunts in New York City history. The killer, who had terrorized 8 million people and had become one of the most notorious criminals in America, was now in custody. But the story was far from over. The world was about to learn the shocking truth about who David Berkowitz really was and what had driven him to commit such horrific crimes. The quiet postal worker from Yonkers was about to reveal the twisted thoughts and supernatural voices that had compelled him to become the son of Sam. The arrest of David Berkowitz sent shockwaves throughout New York City and around the world. After more than a year of terror, the son of Sam was finally in custody. However, many questions remained unanswered. Who was this man who had terrorized an entire city? What had driven him to kill 6 innocent people and wound 7 others? And most importantly, was he truly working alone? Or were there others involved in the crimes? The interrogation of David Berkowitz began in the early morning hours of August 11, 1977, less than 12 hours after his arrest. The questioning was conducted by Detective John Keenan and other members of the Operation Omega Task Force. What they discovered during this interrogation was far stranger than anything they had imagined. Berkowitz was surprisingly cooperative during the questioning. Rather than denying his involvement in the crimes or demanding a lawyer, he seemed almost eager to confess. He readily admitted to being the son of Sam and claimed responsibility for all of the shootings that had been attributed to the serial killer. However, his explanation for why he had committed the crimes was bizarre and disturbing. Berkowitz claimed that he had been receiving commands to kill from supernatural forces. Specifically, he said that demons had been speaking to him through his neighbor Sam Carr's black Labrador retriever, Harvey. "The dog told me to kill," Berkowitz explained to the incredulous detectives. "Sam is the devil. He commands me to kill. The dog's blood is on my hands. He told me to do it. I had to do it." According to Berkowitz, the dog would bark at him constantly, keeping him awake at night and driving him to distraction. But it wasn't just the barking that bothered him. He claimed that the dog was actually speaking to him, delivering messages from Satan himself. These messages commanded him to go out and kill young people, particularly attractive young women. Berkowitz told the detectives that he had tried to resist these commands at first, but that the voices had become increasingly insistent and impossible to ignore. He claimed that the demons had threatened to kill him if he didn't obey their orders, and that he had eventually given in to their demands in order to save his own life. The confession also revealed details about Berkowitz's methods that had not been previously known to the police. He explained how he would drive around the city at night, looking for potential victims. He would park his car some distance away from his targets and would approach them on foot, carrying his .44 caliber revolver in a paper bag to conceal it. Berkowitz described how he would choose his victims almost at random. He wasn't looking for specific types of people, despite the fact that most of his female victims had long dark hair. According to his confession, he was simply following the commands of the demons, who would tell him when and where to strike. He also revealed that he had been responsible for many more crimes than just the son of Sam shootings. Berkowitz confessed to setting over 1,400 fires throughout New York City during the period when he was active as a serial killer. These arson attacks had never been connected to the son of Sam case, but they represented another way that Berkowitz had been terrorizing the city. The fires were set in abandoned buildings, trash cans, and other locations throughout the city. Berkowitz said that setting the fires gave him a sense of power and control, and that watching the chaos and destruction that resulted made him feel important and significant. The demons, he claimed, had also commanded him to set these fires as part of his overall mission of creating terror and destruction. During the confession, Berkowitz also provided details about each of the son of Sam shootings that only the killer could have known. He described the locations, the victims, and the specific circumstances of each attack with remarkable accuracy. This left no doubt in the minds of the investigators that they had indeed captured the right man. However, some aspects of Berkowitz's confession were troubling to the detectives. His description of some of the attacks didn't match exactly with the evidence that had been collected at the crime scenes. There were also discrepancies in some of the witness descriptions compared to Berkowitz's physical appearance. For example, witnesses to the final shooting in Brooklyn had described seeing a man with straggly, light-colored hair, while Berkowitz had dark, curly hair. Some witnesses had also described seeing multiple people near the crime scenes, suggesting that Berkowitz might have had accomplices. When confronted with these discrepancies, Berkowitz would become evasive or would claim that his memory was unclear. He insisted that he had acted alone in all of the attacks, but some investigators began to suspect that there might be more to the story than he was telling them. Despite these concerns, the physical evidence against Berkowitz was overwhelming. The .44 caliber revolver found in his car was definitively linked to all of the Son of Sam shootings through ballistics testing. The handwriting on the letters sent to police and to Jimmy Breslin matched samples of Berkowitz's writing. And his car had been ticketed near the scene of the final shooting, placing him at the location at the time of the crime. Berkowitz also led police to locations throughout the city where he had disposed of evidence from his crimes. He showed them where he had thrown away shell casings from his gun and where he had burned clothing that might have contained gunpowder residue. This information could only have been known by the actual perpetrator of the crimes. The confession session lasted for several hours, during which Berkowitz provided a detailed account of his criminal activities. He seemed almost relieved to be talking about his crimes, as if he had been carrying a tremendous burden that he was finally able to share with someone. However, the strangest part of the confession was Berkowitz's apparent belief in the reality of the demonic voices that he claimed had commanded him to kill. He spoke about these voices with complete conviction, as if he truly believed that supernatural forces had been controlling his actions. "I couldn't help myself," he told the detectives. "The demons made me do it. They wouldn't leave me alone until I killed those people. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I had to obey their commands." This explanation raised important questions about Berkowitz's mental state and his fitness to stand trial. If he truly believed that he had been commanded by demons to commit his crimes, it was possible that he could be found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, the psychiatric examinations that followed would reveal a more complex picture of David Berkowitz's mental condition. While he clearly had serious psychological problems, the question of whether these problems were severe enough to excuse his criminal behavior would become a central issue in his trial. As news of Berkowitz's confession spread throughout New York City and around the world, the public struggled to understand how an ordinary-looking postal worker could have committed such horrific crimes. The man who had terrorized 8 million people turned out to be a quiet, overweight loner who claimed to have been following orders from a talking dog. The confession of David Berkowitz marked the beginning of the end of the Son of Sam case, but it also raised new questions about the nature of evil and the responsibility of individuals for their actions. The world was about to get an even closer look at the twisted mind of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Following his confession, David Berkowitz was formally charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder in connection with the Son of Sam shootings. The question that now faced the legal system was whether Berkowitz was mentally competent to stand trial for his crimes. The issue of Berkowitz's mental state became the central focus of the legal proceedings. His claims about receiving commands from demons through his neighbor's dog raised serious questions about his sanity and his ability to understand the nature of his actions. If he was found to be legally insane at the time of the crimes, he could be committed to a mental institution rather than sent to prison. 3 separate psychiatric evaluations were ordered to assess Berkowitz's mental condition. The examinations were conducted by some of the most respected psychiatrists in New York, and they involved extensive interviews with Berkowitz, as well as psychological testing and analysis. The results of these evaluations were somewhat surprising to those who expected Berkowitz to be found insane. While all 3 psychiatrists agreed that Berkowitz suffered from serious mental illness, they also concluded that he was competent to stand trial and understood the difference between right and wrong. Dr. David Abrahamson, one of the court-appointed psychiatrists, concluded that while Berkowitz had a paranoid personality disorder and other psychological problems, he was not legally insane. He knew what he was doing was wrong, Dr. Abrahamson explained. He took steps to avoid being caught, which shows that he understood the criminal nature of his actions. The psychiatric reports revealed that Berkowitz's claims about demonic possession were likely a way for him to avoid taking full responsibility for his crimes. The doctors concluded that while he may have experienced auditory hallucinations, these were more likely the result of his own psychological problems rather than actual supernatural communications. Dr. Abrahamson's evaluation also uncovered important insights into Berkowitz's motivations for the killings. During their sessions, Berkowitz admitted that his claims about the demon-possessed dog were largely fabricated. He revealed that his real motivation was a deep-seated anger and resentment toward the world, particularly toward women. "I felt rejected by everyone," Berkowitz told Dr. Abrahamson. "I was angry at the world and wanted to get back at it. The killings made me feel powerful and important for the first time in my life." This admission was significant because it showed that Berkowitz's crimes were not the result of mental illness alone, but were also driven by conscious feelings of anger and a desire for revenge. This made it much more difficult for his defense attorneys to argue that he was not responsible for his actions. Despite the psychiatric findings that he was competent to stand trial, Berkowitz's defense attorneys strongly advised him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. They believed that there was a good chance that a jury might find him legally insane, particularly given the bizarre nature of his claimed motivations. However, Berkowitz surprised everyone by refusing to follow his attorney's advice. Instead, he announced that he intended to plead guilty to all charges against him. This decision effectively waived his right to an insanity defense and meant that he would almost certainly face life imprisonment for his crimes. Berkowitz's decision to plead guilty was motivated by several factors. First, he seemed to genuinely feel remorse for his actions and wanted to accept responsibility for what he had done. Second, he was concerned about the impact that a lengthy trial would have on the families of his victims, who would be forced to relive the traumatic events in open court. On May 8, 1978, David Berkowitz appeared in court before Judge Joseph R. Corso to formally enter his plea. The courtroom was packed with reporters, police officials, and family members of the victims. The atmosphere was tense as everyone waited to hear what the son of Sam would say. When Judge Corso asked Berkowitz how he pleaded to the charges of murder and attempted murder, he responded clearly and calmly, "Guilty, Your Honor." The judge then asked Berkowitz a series of questions to ensure that he understood the nature of his plea and the consequences of his actions. Berkowitz answered each question appropriately, demonstrating that he was fully aware of what he was doing. "Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are admitting that you committed these crimes?" Judge Corso asked. "Yes, Your Honor, I do," Berkowitz replied. "Do you understand that you could be sentenced to life in prison as a result of this plea?" "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." The guilty plea was accepted by the court, and a sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. However, the sentencing hearing would prove to be far more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. On May 22, 1978, Berkowitz appeared in court for his sentencing. As Judge Corso was preparing to announce the sentence, Berkowitz suddenly became agitated and began shouting at the court. "I'd kill her again," he screamed, referring to Stacy Moskowitz, his final victim. "I'd kill them all again. Stacy was a whore." Berkowitz then attempted to jump out of a 7th-floor window in the courtroom, apparently in an attempt to kill himself. Court officers quickly restrained him and removed him from the courtroom, but not before he had created a scene that shocked everyone present. The outburst raised new questions about Berkowitz's mental state and his competence to receive sentencing. Judge Corso ordered another psychiatric evaluation to determine whether Berkowitz was mentally capable of understanding his sentence. The additional psychiatric examination concluded that while Berkowitz was clearly disturbed by the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, he was still mentally competent to be sentenced. The evaluation suggested that his outburst was more likely the result of stress and fear rather than a genuine break from reality. On June 12, 1978, Berkowitz was brought back to court for his final sentencing. This time, he appeared calm and composed, and there were no disruptions during the proceedings. Judge Corso sentenced Berkowitz to 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life in prison, one for each of the murders he had committed. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant that Berkowitz would have to serve a minimum of 150 years before he would even be eligible for parole. "You have committed acts of violence and terror that have shocked and horrified this city and this nation," Judge Corso told Berkowitz at sentencing. "Your crimes were cold-blooded, calculated, and completely without justification. The court can only hope that by imposing the sentence, some measure of justice will be served for the victims and their families." Berkowitz listened to the sentence without emotion and was then led away to begin serving his prison term at Attica Correctional Facility, one of New York's maximum security prisons. The sentencing of David Berkowitz brought to a close one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history. The man who had terrorized New York City for over a year and had become known around the world as the Son of Sam was now facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. However, the story of David Berkowitz was far from over. His time in prison would bring new revelations about his crimes, his mental state, and his claims about supernatural influences. The questions about whether he had acted alone and whether his story about demonic possession was true would continue to intrigue investigators and the public for decades to come. David Berkowitz began serving his life sentence at Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York in June 1978. Attica was one of the most notorious maximum security prisons in the United States, known for its harsh conditions and violent inmate population. For a high-profile criminal like the son of Sam, prison life would prove to be both dangerous and psychologically challenging. From the moment he arrived at Attica, Berkowitz was marked as a target by other inmates. Serial killers, particularly those who had killed women and children, were considered the lowest form of life in the prison hierarchy. Many inmates saw attacking the son of Sam as a way to gain respect and reputation within the prison community. Berkowitz was initially placed in protective custody for his own safety, but this isolation made his imprisonment even more difficult to endure. He spent most of his time alone in his cell, with limited contact with other inmates or prison staff. The constant threat of violence and the harsh conditions of maximum security prison began to take a toll on his mental health. During his early years at Attica, Berkowitz fell into a deep depression. He later described this period as the darkest time of his life, even worse than the period when he was committing his crimes. He seriously considered taking his own life and made several suicide attempts. "I felt completely hopeless," Berkowitz would later write. "I was alone, hated by everyone, and facing the prospect of spending the rest of my life in that terrible place. I couldn't see any reason to continue living." The violence that Berkowitz had feared finally caught up with him on July 10, 1979, less than a year after he had arrived at Attica. Another inmate, who was never officially identified, approached Berkowitz in a corridor and slashed his throat with a razor blade. The attack was sudden and vicious, and it nearly killed him. The blade cut deep into Berkowitz's neck, slicing through muscle and coming dangerously close to major blood vessels. He was rushed to the prison medical facility, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. The wound required 56 stitches to close, and Berkowitz was left with a permanent scar across his throat. The attack served as a wake-up call for Berkowitz. He realized that if he was going to survive his prison sentence, he would need to find a way to cope with his circumstances and find some meaning in his life. It was during this period of reflection and recovery that he began what he would later describe as a spiritual journey. In 1987, nearly 10 years into his prison sentence, Berkowitz experienced what he claimed was a religious conversion. According to his own account, he was reading a Bible that had been given to him by another inmate when he suddenly felt the presence of God in his cell. "I was reading about Jesus and his sacrifice for humanity," Berkowitz later wrote, "when I suddenly felt overwhelmed by a sense of God's love and forgiveness. I realized that even someone like me, who had done terrible things, could be forgiven and could find redemption." The conversion experience marked a dramatic change in Berkowitz's behavior and outlook. He began attending prison religious services regularly and started studying Christian theology. He also began corresponding with Christian ministers and organizations outside the prison, seeking guidance and support for his newfound faith. In 1990, Berkowitz was transferred from Attica to Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York. The transfer was partly for security reasons, as his high profile continued to make him a target for other inmates. However, the move also reflected his improved behavior and his participation in prison programs. At Sullivan, Berkowitz became involved in various rehabilitation and educational programs. He earned his high school equivalency diploma and began taking college-level courses. He also became active in the prison's Christian Fellowship program and began counseling other inmates who were struggling with addiction and mental health issues. However, even as Berkowitz was apparently reforming his life in prison, he began making new claims about his crimes that would reignite controversy and speculation about the Son of Sam case. In the mid-1990s, he began claiming that he had not acted alone in the shootings and that he had been part of a larger satanic cult. According to these new claims, Berkowitz said that he had been recruited into a devil-worshipping cult that was responsible for numerous crimes throughout New York. He alleged that the Son of Sam shootings were actually ritual killings that had been planned and coordinated by the cult leadership. Berkowitz claimed that while he had been present at all of the crime scenes, he had not actually pulled the trigger in every shooting. He suggested that other cult members had been the actual shooters in some of the attacks, and that he had been made the scapegoat for all of the crimes. These new allegations prompted a reinvestigation of the Son of Sam case in 1996. Police detectives and independent investigators looked into Berkowitz's claims, interviewing him extensively and re-examining the physical evidence from the original crimes. However, the reinvestigation was unable to find any credible evidence to support Berkowitz's claims about a satanic cult. The ballistics evidence still showed that all of the Son of Sam shootings had been committed with the same .44 caliber revolver that had been found in Berkowitz's possession. No evidence was found of other participants in the crimes. Many investigators concluded that Berkowitz's new claims were simply another attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. They noted that his allegations about a satanic cult had emerged only after he had become a born-again Christian, and they suggested that he might be trying to portray himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Despite the lack of evidence to support his cult allegations, Berkowitz continued to maintain these claims throughout the 1990s and 2000s. He gave interviews to journalists and researchers, providing detailed descriptions of the supposed cult activities and naming alleged cult members. In 2002, Berkowitz became eligible for parole after serving 25 years of his sentence. However, his parole application was denied, and it has been denied at every subsequent hearing. The parole board has consistently concluded that Berkowitz continues to pose a threat to public safety and that his crimes were too serious to warrant release. During his parole hearings, Berkowitz has expressed remorse for his crimes and has spoken about his religious conversion and his efforts to help other inmates. However, the parole board has remained unconvinced that he should be released from prison. The nature and severity of your offenses were such as to create a danger to society, the parole board wrote in one of their decisions. Your criminal acts terrorized an entire city and resulted in the deaths of 6 innocent people. Despite your expressions of remorse and your religious conversion, the board finds that your release would not be in the best interests of the community. Berkowitz is currently housed at Shongum Correctional Facility, about 60 miles north of New York City. At the age of 70, he continues to participate in prison programs and maintains his Christian faith. He has written several books about his experiences and his religious conversion, and he corresponds regularly with people outside the prison who are interested in his story. Despite his age and his decades of imprisonment, Berkowitz continues to be denied parole every 2 years when he becomes eligible for review. His most recent parole hearing in May 2024 resulted in his 12th denial, and his next hearing is scheduled for 2026. Many observers believe that Berkowitz will never be released from prison, regardless of his behavior or his expressions of remorse. The nature of his crimes and the terror that he caused have made him one of the most hated criminals in American history, and public sentiment strongly favors keeping him incarcerated for life. For the families of his victims, Berkowitz's continued imprisonment provides some measure of justice and closure. While nothing can bring back their loved ones or erase the pain that he caused, they can at least have the satisfaction of knowing that he will likely spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. The case of David Berkowitz and the Son of Sam murders had a profound and lasting impact on American society that extended far beyond the borders of New York City. The crimes and their aftermath influenced everything from criminal investigation techniques to media coverage of serial killers to laws governing how criminals can profit from their notoriety. One of the most significant changes that resulted from the Son of Sam case was the way that police departments approached serial killer investigations. The Operation Omega Task Force that was created to catch Berkowitz became a model for how law enforcement agencies should coordinate their efforts when dealing with crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries. Before the Son of Sam case, police departments in different boroughs and cities often worked independently, sharing little information with each other. The Berkowitz investigation demonstrated the importance of centralizing information and resources when dealing with a serial offender who might strike anywhere within a large metropolitan area. The psychological profiling techniques that were used during the investigation also became more sophisticated and standardized as a result of the case. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which had been established just a few years earlier, was able to provide valuable insights into the killer's personality and likely behavior patterns. The Son of Sam case also marked a turning point in how the media covered serial killer cases. The extensive publicity that surrounded Berkowitz and his crimes helped to establish the template for how newspapers and television news programs would cover similar cases in the future. The intense media coverage had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, the widespread publicity helped to keep the public informed about the ongoing investigation and encouraged people to report suspicious activity to the police. The media coverage also put pressure on political leaders and police officials to dedicate adequate resources to catching the killer. However, the media coverage also had some negative consequences. Critics argued that the sensationalized reporting of the crimes gave Berkowitz exactly the kind of attention and notoriety that he was seeking. The extensive coverage may have encouraged other potential serial killers to seek similar fame through violence. The letters that Berkowitz sent to journalist Jimmy Breslin became a particular point of controversy. While the publication of portions of these letters was undoubtedly newsworthy, some critics argued that printing them gave the killer a platform to spread his twisted message and might have inspired copycat crimes. Perhaps the most lasting legal legacy of the Son of Sam case was the creation of Son of Sam laws, designed to prevent criminals from profiting financially from their crimes. These laws were enacted in response to the concern that Berkowitz and other high-profile criminals might be able to make money by selling their stories to publishers, movie studios, or other media companies. The first Son of Sam law was passed by the New York State Legislature in 1977, just months after Berkowitz's arrest. The law required that any money paid to a criminal for their story be placed in an escrow account, where it could be claimed by the victims of their crimes or their families. The New York law served as a model for similar legislation in other states, and eventually, most states in the country adopted some form of Son of Sam law. The federal government also passed legislation that prevented federal inmates from profiting from their crimes. However, the Son of Sam laws faced legal challenges almost from the moment they were enacted. Critics argued that these laws violated the First Amendment rights of criminals and publishers by restricting their ability to engage in commercial speech. The most significant legal challenge to Son of Sam laws came in the 1991 Supreme Court case Simon and Schuster v. New York Crime Victims Board. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that New York's Son of Sam law was unconstitutional because it was too broad and could potentially apply to any work that described criminal activity, including classic works of literature. As a result of this ruling, many states had to rewrite their Son of Sam laws to make them more narrowly focused on preventing criminals from profiting specifically from their own crimes. The revised laws have generally been upheld by the courts, and they continue to serve as an important tool for ensuring that criminals cannot benefit financially from their notoriety. The Son of Sam case also had a significant impact on the study of criminal psychology and the understanding of serial killer behavior. The case provided researchers with detailed information about the development and progression of a serial killer's activities, from Berkowitz's troubled childhood through his military service and his eventual crimes. The psychological evaluations of Berkowitz revealed important insights into the factors that can contribute to the development of violent criminal behavior. His history of adoption, childhood trauma, social isolation, and mental illness became part of a growing body of research into the backgrounds of serial killers. However, researchers have been careful to note that while Berkowitz's background contained many risk factors for criminal behavior, millions of people experience similar circumstances without becoming violent criminals. The case highlighted the complex interaction of psychological, social, and biological factors that can lead to criminal behavior. The case also contributed to public understanding of mental illness and its relationship to criminal behavior. Berkowitz's claims about hearing voices and being commanded by demons helped to raise awareness about psychotic disorders and their potential consequences. However, the case also contributed to some negative stereotypes about mental illness. The fact that Berkowitz later admitted that many of his claims about demonic possession were fabricated demonstrated that not all unusual behavior by criminals can be attributed to genuine mental illness. For the city of New York, the Son of Sam case became part of the urban mythology that surrounds the city's most difficult period in the 1970s. Along with other high-profile crimes and social problems, the Son of Sam murders came to symbolize the urban decay and social dysfunction that characterized New York during this era. However, the successful resolution of the case also demonstrated the resilience and determination of New York's police force and its citizens. The fact that Berkowitz was ultimately caught and brought to justice showed that even in the most challenging circumstances, law and order could prevail. The victims of Berkowitz's crimes and their families became advocates for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. Organizations like the Stacy Moskowitz Foundation worked to support other crime victims and to ensure that their voices were heard in the criminal justice system. The case also highlighted the long-term impact that violent crime can have on survivors and family members. The physical and psychological trauma experienced by Berkowitz's victims who survived his attacks, such as Robert Violante and Jody Valeni, demonstrated the lifelong consequences of violent crime. In popular culture, the Son of Sam case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, movies, and television programs. These works have helped to keep the case in the public consciousness and have introduced new generations to the story of David Berkowitz and his crimes. However, this continued attention has been a mixed blessing for the survivors and families of the victims. While some have welcomed the opportunity to tell their stories and honor the memory of their loved ones, others have found the continued media attention to be painful and intrusive. The case has also become a subject of ongoing controversy and speculation. Some researchers and journalists continue to investigate Berkowitz's claims about a satanic cult, despite the lack of credible evidence to support these allegations. These investigations have kept the case in the news and have led to new books and documentaries that explore various conspiracy theories about the crimes. While most law enforcement officials and serious researchers reject these theories, they continue to attract public interest and generate debate. As David Berkowitz continues to serve his life sentence and is repeatedly denied parole, the Son of Sam case remains a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists in human nature and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would harm innocent people. The case also serves as a testament to the dedication and professionalism of the law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to bring Berkowitz to justice. Their efforts ensured that one of America's most notorious serial killers was caught and punished for his crimes. To truly understand the story of David Berkowitz and the Son of Sam murders, it is essential to look beyond the sensational headlines and examine the complex psychological and social factors that created one of America's most notorious serial killers. The transformation of Richard David Falco, an unwanted baby given up for adoption, into David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, is a study in how personal trauma, mental illness, and social isolation can combine to produce devastating consequences. The roots of Berkowitz's criminal behavior can be traced back to his earliest experiences as an adopted child. The knowledge that his birth mother had voluntarily given him up created a fundamental sense of rejection and abandonment that would shape his personality for the rest of his life. This early trauma was compounded by the emotional distance of his adoptive parents and the death of his adoptive mother when he was just 14 years old. Child psychologists have long recognized that early experiences of abandonment and loss can have profound effects on a person's ability to form healthy relationships and cope with stress. In Berkowitz's case, these early traumas seem to have created a deep-seated anger and resentment toward the world that would eventually manifest in violence. The social isolation that Berkowitz experienced throughout his childhood and adolescence also contributed to his psychological problems. He was never able to form close friendships or romantic relationships, leaving him feeling increasingly disconnected from other people. This isolation was both a cause and a consequence of his growing mental health problems. During his teenage years, Berkowitz began exhibiting many of the warning signs that psychologists now associate with potential serial killers. His fascination with fire, his cruelty to animals, and his difficulty forming relationships are all part of what researchers call the homicidal triad of behaviors that can predict future violence. However, it's important to note that many people experience similar childhood traumas and exhibit similar warning signs without becoming violent criminals. What made Berkowitz different was the combination of his psychological vulnerabilities with specific environmental factors and possibly biological predispositions toward mental illness. The voices that Berkowitz claimed to hear commanding him to kill were likely symptoms of a serious mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. However, the fact that he was able to function normally in his job as a postal worker and was able to plan and execute his crimes so carefully suggests that his mental illness was not as severe as his claims about demonic possession might suggest. The psychiatric evaluations that were conducted during Berkowitz's trial concluded that while he suffered from mental illness, he was not legally insane at the time of his crimes. This distinction is crucial because it means that he understood the difference between right and wrong and could be held responsible for his actions. The evolution of Berkowitz's claims about his motivations is also revealing. Initially, he claimed that he was commanded to kill by demons speaking through his neighbor's dog. Later, he admitted that this story was largely fabricated and that his real motivation was anger and resentment toward the world. Still later, he claimed that he had been part of a satanic cult and had not acted alone. These changing stories suggest that Berkowitz was never entirely honest about his motivations, even with himself. He seemed to be constantly searching for explanations that would make his crimes seem less heinous, or that would shift responsibility away from himself. The fact that Berkowitz chose to target young couples and attractive young women reveals important insights into his psychological state. These victims represented the normal social relationships and romantic happiness that he had never been able to achieve. By destroying these relationships, he was symbolically attacking the world that he felt had rejected him. The randomness of his attacks was also psychologically significant. Unlike many serial killers who target specific types of victims or who have personal connections to their victims, Berkowitz chose his targets almost at random. This suggests that his anger was directed at society as a whole rather than at specific individuals or groups. The letters that Berkowitz sent to the police and to journalist Jimmy Breslin reveal a man who was desperate for attention and recognition. The son of Sam persona that he created allowed him to become famous and feared, giving him the sense of importance and power that he had never felt before. The religious conversion that Berkowitz experienced in prison appears to have been genuine, at least to some extent. His behavior in prison has been exemplary for decades, and he has consistently expressed remorse for his crimes. However, some observers remain skeptical about whether his conversion is authentic or whether it is simply another attempt to manipulate people's perceptions of him. The continued denial of Berkowitz's parole applications suggests that society is not ready to forgive him for his crimes, regardless of his apparent transformation. The nature of his crimes was so shocking and the impact on his victims and their families was so devastating that he may never be considered suitable for release. From a criminological perspective, the Berkowitz case highlights the importance of early intervention and mental health treatment for troubled individuals. Many of the warning signs of his future criminal behavior were present during his childhood and adolescence, but they were not recognized or addressed by the adults in his life. The case also demonstrates the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. While Berkowitz clearly suffered from psychological problems, these problems do not excuse or fully explain his actions. He made conscious choices to commit violent crimes, and he must be held responsible for those choices. The story of David Berkowitz serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from seemingly ordinary circumstances and that the capacity for violence exists within human nature. However, it also demonstrates that even the most notorious criminals can apparently change and find redemption, even if society is not willing to forgive them. For the families of Berkowitz's victims, the question of whether he has truly changed is less important than the fact that he has been held accountable for his crimes. Their loved ones are gone forever, and no amount of remorse or religious conversion can bring them back. The case of the son of Sam will continue to fascinate and horrify people for generations to come. It represents one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, but it also demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice. David Berkowitz remains in prison today, an elderly man serving multiple life sentences for crimes he committed as a young adult. Whether he has truly found redemption or whether he is simply a skilled manipulator will never be known for certain. What is certain is that his actions during that terrible summer of 1977 changed countless lives forever and left an indelible mark on American society. The story of the son of Sam is ultimately a tragedy for all involved, for the innocent victims who lost their lives or were forever changed by their encounters with evil, for the families who lost loved ones or watched them suffer, and even for David Berkowitz himself, whose early experiences of abandonment and rejection set him on a path toward becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers. As we look back on this case nearly 50 years later, we can learn important lessons about the factors that can contribute to violent criminal behavior and the importance of addressing mental health issues and social isolation before they lead to tragedy. The story of David Berkowitz serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the preciousness of human life and the importance of protecting innocent people from those who would do them harm. In the end, the Son of Sam case stands as one of the most significant criminal cases in American history, not just because of the terror it created or the media attention it generated, but because of the insights it provided into the nature of evil and the capacity of human beings to both inflict and endure unimaginable suffering. The legacy of David Berkowitz and his crimes will continue